Okay, it looks like I'm on. How is everyone doing out there? This is Kit's Rock Review. I'm Kit, and you probably were a little surprised about a few hours ago when I put a post up that said "Happy Birthday to Genesis keyboard player Tony Banks." You're like thinking, I've been putting all these Allman Brothers posts up. Isn't this guy a big Southern rock fan? Well, yeah, I am a big Southern rock fan, but I'm also a big prog rock fan. And Genesis, which was the band that Tony Banks was in, was a forefront of the prog rock genre in the 70s, 80s, and even into the 90s. So, I have my Genesis shirt here from when I saw them. I also got Genesis chapter and verse book right here. And it even has a timeline of the band. And it says here, that's what I was looking at last night, 1950, 27 March, because this is a British book. 27 March, Tony Banks, born in Sussex. So here's a 70s picture of the birthday boy right there. Of course, this is a 70s picture when he was in his 20s. Now he's in the 1920s. He is 70, and I don't think he has quite those brown locks anymore. But to me, as a fan of Genesis and prog rock, Tony Banks is more responsible for the sound of Genesis than any of the other members of the band. He was involved in the band when it formed, and when he formed it at his high school with Peter Gabriel and Mike Rutherford. And he was at it when it finally broke up in the late 90s. And I think his keyboard sound is more integral to it than Mike Rutherford, who was the bassist slash guitarist. Because it's been more of a keyboard band than a guitar band. So today, since Tony Banks' birthday, a lot of you guys should be playing some Genesis and maybe even a little Tony Banks solo stuff. When I initially posted that little post I had, I said that you should all, if you want to celebrate his birthday, you should listen to this, A Trick of the Tail, which is the first Genesis album without Peter Gabriel. This is when Phil Collins took over as the lead vocalist. And probably the best example of Tony Banks' work with Genesis. He either wrote or co-wrote every track on this album. Entangled, nice little piano piece in there that he and Steve Hackett co-wrote. Mad Mad Moon, awesome song. And you got Ripples, which starts out with this piano, then goes to a guitar and back to piano again. And by the way, Ripples, when I was a DJ at WPNR, Utica College Radio back in the 90s, Ripples was the song I ended my senior year show, the last show I ever did at WPNR as a senior. I ended it with Ripples. It's a song about growing old and being responsible. So I figured that was a thing to end my college radio career on. But you know what? There are other albums besides this one that you should listen to today to celebrate Tony Banks' birthday. So let's start with a couple albums from the Peter Gabriel era of Genesis. This is my favorite Peter Gabriel era album, Selling England by the Pound. Here, let me get it up close to try not to get the Selling England by the Pound with the lawnmower, because one of their songs on the front right there, because one of their songs, because I know what I like, and one of the lyrics is about being a lawnmower. Kind of wonder what about Peter Gabriel sometimes. But on this album, second track on this album, The Firth of Fifth, begins with a Tony Banks keyboard solo and it's played on the grand piano. So that's an awesome way to begin a song. Also, you've got the Battle of Epping Forest. Primarily the lyrics are primarily by Peter Gabriel, but the music with it's the Battle of Epping. And anyway, also the Cinema Show, which has some great keyboard solos by Tony Banks, got some Steve Hackett guitar solos on it. So if you like the Peter Gabriel era of Genesis, this might be something to check out. Also, we'll stick with the Peter Gabriel era, The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway. And lyrically, this is a Peter Gabriel solo album. He wrote all the lyrics on this album. But musically, Tony Banks and Mike Rutherford wrote most of the music. So, there's the title track, which begins with that Tony Banks keyboard solo. Then you got I'm going to mispronounce this, but the Lamia is a song on the album, and it's actually about these like snake-like women that come and bite. That's what the lyrics are about. But the music underneath is a really pretty piano piece. And then, of course, there's the Carpet Crawlers on this, which is sort of the big single from the album. And Phil Collins claims that in Genesis's time, all they ever wanted to do was try to rewrite Carpet Crawlers. And that's when I saw them in concert. That's actually what they ended with in 2007 on their last tour. Okay, so that's Peter Gabriel era. I mean, there's other, you could get Foxtrot, which has Supper's Ready on it too, but I'm trying to highlight the Tony Banks stuff. So now let's move on to the Phil Collins era of Genesis. And here's my favorite Genesis album, Duke. They were getting a little poppy in this, but they didn't totally abandon their prog rock roots. And it does have a little song cycle on it. That's awesome. Duchess, which is the song about a rock star who gets famous and then she loses her crowd and doesn't know what to do. It's got some great Tony Banks keyboard stuff on it. Cul-de-sac is Tony Banks wrote that without help from the rest of the members of the band, and it sounds like a classic 70-ish Genesis song, even though this came out in 1980. And, of course, the instrumental that ends the album, Duke's Travels and Duke's End. It's heavy with Tony Banks' stuff on it. The other Phil Collins era album for Tony Banks that I'm going to talk about is the Genesis album. Some people call this the Mama album because the Mama is the first song on the album. Other people call it the Shapes album because it's got these little shapes on it. But this is another big Tony Banks album. Just, second song on the album. That's all. Opens with that Tony Banks keyboard track. And believe it or not, that was originally written by Mike Rutherford on guitar, and then Tony Banks heard that. He's like, I wonder what that sounds like on keyboards. And he played that opening riff on the keyboards, and thus was born a song. But then you got Home by the Sea and Second Home by the Sea. I've always considered Home by the Sea and Second Home by the Sea one song, just one long song, and I can't stand it when radio stations cut it off at the end of Home by the Sea. Because the second half of that song with the keyboard, guitar solos, even Phil Collins' electronic drum solos, that's like the best part of the song, and the radio stations always cut that off. So if I ever owned a radio station, a classic rock radio station, Home by the Sea and Second Home by the Sea would always be played together in their entirety. But anyway, then on the second side, by the way, yes, when I first got this album, I had it on cassette. And on the second side, near the end, there's a song called The Silver Rainbow, which is very Tony Banks-esque, otherworldly fantasy type song, which is kind of cool. And of course, it's going to get better. If you're ever depressed, it's going to get better is a nice song to listen to from this album. So those are some of the Genesis, the common, not really deep, a couple from Peter Gabriel era, a couple from the Phil Collins era. But what about some deep cuts? If you're really deep diving into Tony Banks. Well, if you're like me, as the Genesis fan, I bought all these Genesis box sets, including the 76 to 82 Genesis box set, and it has a extra disc in it called Extra Tracks, and there's some deep cuts on there that are awesome. One is called Inside and Out. It was originally left off the Wind and Wuthering album, and I don't know why they left it off the Wind and Wuthering album. It's an awesome song. They eventually put it on an EP, but I don't even know if you can get it on. I don't even think you can get it on a streaming service, so it's hard to find. Inside and Out. It starts out as this, typical song, and the ending has this really rapid fire Tony Banks keyboard solo. It's like, and it's just, I don't know why they left it off. I don't know what they were thinking. I've heard that, we only had so much space on an album, but you take one of the other songs that's not as good off. There's another song on here called The Day the Lights Went Out, which is about an alien invasion, which is a heavily, Tony Banks heavy keyboardish, and Evidence of Autumn, which is a nice little piano piece. Talks about, guess what, the fall starting. And finally, I'll end it with this. If you really want a deep cut for Tony Banks to help celebrate his birthday on March 27th today, his 1983 solo album, The Fugitive. This is the only, he released a number of solo albums, but he never sang on them. This is the only solo album where Tony Banks is the primary singer. Actually, he's the only singer on this album. And you can tell why he didn't become the lead singer of Genesis when Peter Gabriel left. I mean, he's not a bad singer. He's better than me. He's better than Bob Dylan, so that's something. But he doesn't have a very big range in his voice. He's an average singer, and he knows it. And the songs on this album don't have very much dynamic range. There's a lot of instrumentals, but he knew that. So when he came up with this album, it does sound very early '80s ish. But my favorite song on this album is called "The Wheels Keep Turning." He also released one of these as a single. I don't think it really did anything. "This Is Love," which is the song that opens the album. But if you can find this, so it's a really, really decent album for Tony Banks. Not for Tony Banks, a really decent album for anybody. So if you can find it, Tony Banks, The Fugitive. Help celebrate Tony Banks' birthday by buying some of his records too. Okay, so let's just end this thing. So what about you guys? Is there any Tony Banks Genesis stuff that I left off? I could just say, if you want to celebrate Tony Banks' birthday, listen to all the Genesis albums, because he's on all of them. But I wanted to keep things short. I mean, I did leave off Wind and Wuthering, which has One for the Vine, which is a 9-minute Tony Banks written song. But what else? After you watch the video, in the comments, let me know if there's some Tony Banks Genesis song that you really like. I'm going to later put up a little Tony Banks playlist in the comments. So everyone, get out your Genesis vinyl, your Genesis CD. If you have to, go on Spotify and listen to it. And celebrate Tony Banks' birthday. So happy birthday, Tony Banks. Everyone else, just remember to keep on rocking in the free world. And I'll